Montana Territory, April 1879. Keziah Garner gripped the hem of her brown calico skirt, the fabric damp with snow melt and shaking fingers. Her breath came fast, white steam in the chilled spring air, as the church bell in the valley tolled twice. She stood at the edge of the wooden bridge overlooking Cold Creek, her boots sinking into half-thawed mud. Behind her, the town of Redfern waited quiet, watching, ready to see her married off to a man she did not love. A man twice her age, with teeth yellowed from tobacco and hands that gripped too hard. She had not agreed, not truly. But her uncle had made the deal. And after her parents died last winter, she had no one left to speak for her. No one but the man riding hard through the trees now, his coat flapping behind him like wings, and his horse lathered with sweat. Branick O'Dell. She saw him before she heard him. The way he sat the saddle upright, steady, like he was built from the same iron as the rails stretching west. His jaw was set, mouth hard, and dark hair whipped around his face beneath his worn hat. Keziah's breath caught. The townsfolk had whispered about Branick for years. About the fire that took his wife and child. About the way he disappeared into the hills afterward, more ghost than man. But Keziah had never believed the gossip. She remembered him from when she was a girl. He had taught her to braid rope, once, when she was barely tall enough to reach his belt. He had been kind then. Quiet, but kind. Now he was thundering down the hill like the storm she had prayed for. Just behind him, the church doors swung open. Amos Tripp stepped out in a dark coat, his gray whiskers twitching in irritation. "Where the hell is she?" he barked. "I am here," Keziah said, her voice tight. She turned slowly from the bridge, her hands clenched at her sides. Amos saw her. And then he saw Branick. "What in God's name?" Branick reined his horse hard, dismounted before the animal had fully stopped. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud. "You are not marrying him," he said, voice low and shaking with fury. Amos narrowed his eyes. "You have no say in this, Cowboy." Branick stepped between them. "I do. Not while I still breathe." Keziah's heart stuttered. She could not move. She had not seen him in over 2 years, not since her father's funeral. But now he was here, standing in front of her like a wall of warmth and safety. "You lost your land," Amos spat. "You are nothing, Branick. And she is mine by blood. She is not a piece of cattle," Branick growled. Keziah blinked fast, a sharp ache behind her eyes. "I do not want him, Branick." He turned to her then, his eyes softening. "I know. I have no place to go." "You do now." The sound of the gathered crowd grew louder. Murmurs. Disbelief. But Branick did not flinch. He held out his hand to her, palm open. Keziah hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. Branick tugged her close, not rough but sure. "You come with me, now. I will not let him take you." Amos surged forward. "That girl is my blood!" Branick's voice cut through the air. "And she is not yours to give." Amos froze. The crowd did too. Keziah looked up at Branick, her hand still in his. "Where will we go?" "I built a cabin near the river bend," he said. "It is rough, but it is safe. You will be safe." Her throat tightened. "You did not build it for me." He met her eyes. "I built it for someone who needed it." "Turns out that is you." They left that afternoon. Branick saddled up his second mare and helped her up gently, his hand brushing her back longer than necessary. She did not protest. Her body was still trembling from the shock of it all, but beside him, she felt steadier. They rode in silence at first, the snow crunching beneath hooves, the pines casting long shadows through the lowering sun. When they reached the cabin, a modest one-room structure with a stone chimney, and logs still smelling of fresh sap, Keziah dismounted slowly. Her legs ached. "You built all this by yourself?" she asked softly, taking in the stacked woodpile, the iron stove inside, the wool blanket folded neatly on the cot. Branick nodded. "I needed something to do with my hands." She stepped inside and ran her fingers along the windowsill. It is warm. He followed her in, closing the door behind them. It will be dark soon. I will get the fire going. He moved with practiced ease, striking flint, feeding kindling. Keziah knelt beside him, her hands folded in her lap. I should thank you, she said. You do not owe me anything. She looked up, studying his face in the firelight. The years had carved lines around his eyes, but there was something softer beneath it. Something familiar. I remember you, she whispered. From before everything changed. He looked at her then, full and direct. I remember you too. The flame caught in the hearth, casting golden light across the room. Keziah did not move. She could feel something inside her shifting, something she had kept locked down for so long now stirring to life. Branick sat back on his heels. You are safe here. You stay as long as you need. Her lips parted. And if I want to stay forever? He blinked. Then I will build you a second room. She smiled, the first real one in days. And if I do not want to sleep in a different room? Branick's breath hitched. His eyes searched hers, slow and careful. Then I will not make you. She leaned forward, just enough to feel the edge of his breath brush her cheek. Branick, she said, why did you come for me? He did not answer with words. Instead, he lifted his hand and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers warm and rough. His thumb lingered against her cheek. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. Because I could not let you be taken by someone who would never see you. She reached for his hand and pressed it tighter to her skin. I see you, she whispered. And for the first time in years, Branick O'Dell let himself believe he might not be alone anymore. The wind shifted through the trees the next morning with the scent of thawing earth and wet pine. Keziah stood at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched steam rise from the river. A jay called from somewhere high above, sharp and insistent. The world was waking, and she didn't quite know what to do with the stillness. Inside, Branick moved with quiet purpose. She could hear the scrape of a tin cup, the low creak of the iron stove as he adjusted the draft. She hadn't spoken much after they arrived, too shaken to form questions, too tired to chase answers. But now the silence between them felt full rather than hollow. When she stepped back into the cabin, he handed her a warm biscuit wrapped in a cloth napkin. It ain't much. I'll hunt later. Rabbit if we're lucky. She sat slowly on the bench near the wall, chewing thoughtfully. How long have you been living out here? Branick leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. Since last summer. After I sold what was left of the spread. Figured nobody'd miss me. Keziah set the biscuit down. You knew they would try to marry me off. I suspected, he said. Your uncle was never the sort to carry grief long. Not if he saw a chance to trade it for something easier. She traced a knot in the wood with her thumb. He said I'd be safe. That Amos had money, and land, and that I'd be taken care of. Branick didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low. There's a kind of safety that feels like drowning. You don't notice it at first, not until you stop breathing. She looked up at him, then. And this? She asked. Is this safe? I reckon it's not easy, he said. But I'll never use you to settle a debt. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Branick crossed the room and opened a chest near the far wall. He pulled out a folded length of wool and set it beside her. There's mending needs doing, he said. If you're of a mind to keep your hands busy. If not, that's fine. She ran her fingers along the fabric. You sew? He shrugged. Poorly. I bleed more than the cloth most days. Keziah let out a soft breath that could almost have been a laugh. I can mend. Branick nodded once, then moved to the door. I'll need to cut more wood before night. Snow's not done with us yet. She watched him go, the doors swinging shut behind him. Something quiet settled in her chest, not peace, not yet, but the shape of it. By mid-afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds in fits and starts. Keziah stepped outside with the mending in her lap, stitching beneath the lean shadow of the cabin. Branick worked deeper in the trees, the rhythm of his axe splitting silence in steady arcs. He returned with the wheelbarrow half full, his shirt damp at the collar, face flushed from effort. She stood to help without asking, collecting the smaller pieces while he stacked the larger logs near the door. "I can carry more than that," she said, brushing a wood chip from her sleeve. "I know," he replied. "But I'd rather your hands stay in one piece." She raised an eyebrow. "You think I've never chopped wood before? I think you've done more than most women and been thanked less for it." She paused, a log balanced in her arms. "That's not a thing men usually admit." "I'm not most men," he said simply. They worked until the shadows grew long, stopping only when the chill returned with the fading light. Inside again, she stirred the pot of beans warming over the fire while Branick sat near the door, carving a length of hickory down to a smooth handle. "You never asked what I wanted," she said, not looking up. "I didn't figure you owed me that." "I don't." She stirred slower. "But I want you to know. I never planned to marry anyone." Branick set the knife down. "You don't have to explain yourself." "I know. I just want to say it." He waited. "I was going to teach. My father had started talking with the circuit rider about putting up a schoolhouse. I'd done lessons with the younger children in town. It felt like something good. Something mine." Branick's voice was quiet. "You could still teach." "Not in Redfern." "Not now." He nodded, eyes on the fire. "Then maybe someplace new." She looked at him fully. "Would you leave this place?" His jaw shifted. "I would if there was reason." "And if I asked you to?" "I'd go," he said plainly. "But I wouldn't push you to run again so soon." Keziah felt her throat tighten. "You're not what I expected. I've been told worse." She smiled. "I'm not afraid here." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's what I want for you. Not comfort. Not safety that comes with chains. Just the knowing that you can breathe." The fire cracked between them, and the night wrapped around the cabin like a quiet promise. She rose and crossed the room, standing before him with the hem of her skirt brushing his boots. "I think I've been holding my breath since winter." Branick didn't move. She reached out, fingers finding the edge of his sleeve. "It's easier now." His eyes lifted to hers, something steady and careful behind them. "You don't have to rush." "I'm not," she said. "I'm just not turning away either." He stood, slow and measured, and rested his hand lightly over hers. The wind outside softened to a hush, and inside, the warmth held. By early May, the snow had retreated to the mountain ridges, leaving the valley floor rich with mud and green shoots. Keziah woke to birdsong, unfamiliar and layered, and the smell of coffee drifting from the hearth. Branick had already gone out. He rose before her most mornings, moving quiet as twilight, and always left something warm to eat. She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped onto the porch, blinking against the rising sun. The air still bit a little, but the trees were budding, and the river ran high from meltwater. Across the clearing, Branick was mending the fence line, sleeves rolled, his hat shadowing his face as he worked a mallet against a brace post. Keziah crossed to him, boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. "You plan to fence in the whole south side?" He didn't pause. "Not the whole of it. Just enough to keep out strays. Last week I saw a pair of half-wild steers nosing around the beans." She knelt at the edge of the post pile and picked up a length of wire. "You fix things like you've been doing it your whole life." Branick leaned against the post, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "My father built fences every spring. Said it was the only way to know what belonged to you. That always sit right with you." He looked at her for a long beat. "Didn't know? But I didn't say much back then." She straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt. "There's more ways to keep a thing than by drawing lines around it." His mouth curved, not quite into a smile, but something close. You ever want to put your hands to the hammer, I'll step aside. I'll take you up on that, she said. But not today. I want to walk the edge of the ridge before the sun gets too strong. Branick nodded. Take my rifle. Trail's still soft up that way. You see tracks, don't follow him. She took the rifle from where it leaned against the porch rail. I'll be back before dusk. He didn't answer, just watched her go with a gaze that felt like the quiet kind of promise. The woods were damp and full of sound. Keziah took the narrow path that wound behind the cabin and up through the pines. The climb steepened, but her legs had grown stronger since arriving. She no longer lost breath so easily. When she reached the overlook, she sat on a flat stone and let her eyes travel across the valley. The town of Redfern was hidden behind the hills, but the land stretched clear down to where the cottonwoods thickened along the far creek. She didn't miss the town. Not the eyes. Not the quiet judgment of shopkeepers who'd once praised her mother's pies but changed their tone after the funeral. Still, she could feel the tether of her old life like a frayed thread tugging at her hem. Footsteps behind her drew her attention. Branick had come up the slope, rifle slung across his back, shoulders rising and falling with breath. Didn't expect you, she said. You were gone longer than I liked. I wasn't gone at all long. Branick sat beside her, setting his rifle down. I know. But the ridge doesn't forgive distractions. She looked out again. I used to come up here with my father. He'd tell me stories about the first settlers who passed through. Said one man tried to plant wheat up here. Branick picked up a pine cone and turned it in his hand. Fool's errand. He failed, she said. But he tried, Branick replied. She studied him. Why did you really build the cabin? He didn't meet her eyes. I needed to remember I could make something that didn't burn. They sat in silence after that, the breeze cool against their faces. A hawk circled far above, wings stretched wide. Keziah spoke again, voice low. I've been thinking about the old chapel. The one near the river bend. It's fallen in some, but the frame's still sound. What about it? I want to fix it up. Use it for a school. There's children scattered all through these hills. Some ride 5 miles to Redfern and back for lessons that barely last an hour. He nodded slowly. You need help. I need lumber. And someone to carry it. Branick raised an eyebrow. You asking? I am. All right. She smiled, brushing dust from her skirt. You don't even ask what's in it for you. I've never needed more than a reason, he said. They descended together, taking the long way down through the birches. Branick offered his hand once when the ground slipped beneath her boots, and she took it without pause. That night, they ate by lantern light. The beans were gone, replaced by roasted quail Branick had brought in earlier. Keziah cleared the plates and poured heated water into the basin by the door. As she dried her hands, Branick's voice stirred the quiet. I sent a letter. She turned. To who? Old friend in Bozeman. He works with the freight lines. Said he'll send lumber, if I cover the hauling. She stepped closer. You did that today? While you were out walking the ridge. Keziah touched his arm, fingers light. You don't know how much that means to me. I don't need to know, he said. But I'll keep doing it. She stood before him, the space between them narrowing. Her voice was soft but certain. I want to stay. His eyes searched hers. You already are. She leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek, then resting against his. He didn't pull her closer, not yet, but his breath caught, and she felt the shift in him like a tide turning. I'm not afraid, she whispered. He drew her hand to his chest, holding it there. Then we build forward. And they did. The rains came before the lumber did. Cold, steady sheets that pinned Keziah and Branick inside for 3 days, soaking the hills and turning the path to the river bend into a ribbon of clay. The wind found every crack in the cabin's walls, and the fire had to be fed near constant. Branick repaired the chinking between logs with fresh moss and mud. Keziah sewed by lamplight, fingers moving through fabric grown familiar. They didn't speak much during the storm, the kind of quiet that came not from absence, but from ease. She would glance up from her stitching, find him sanding a cedar board or oiling the hinges on the trapdoor, and think, this is a man who needs no noise to be present. On the fourth morning, the clouds broke. Mist clung to the trees, and the air was thick with the smell of damp pine and wet earth. Branick opened the door and stood for a long while, eyes on the trail that disappeared into the woods. "You expecting someone?" Keziah asked, rising from where she'd been kneeling over the stove. He stepped out onto the porch. "Wagon tracks. 2 sets. One fresh, one older." She joined him, gaze following his. The ruts were faint, just shadows pressed into soft ground. "Could be the freight," he said. "Could be someone else," she said. He nodded once and went back inside to fetch the rifle. By midday, the wagon rolled into view, pulled by a swayback mule and driven by a man with a tobacco pouch tucked into his vest and a pencil behind one ear. His beard was patchy, and he wore spectacles that kept sliding down the bridge of his nose. "You Branick O'Dell?" the man called, reining in. "That's right." The man reached behind the seat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Got your lumber. 8 boards short, had to swap out 1/2 inch for 3/4. You'll make do?" "I've made do with worse." The man grinned, showing a gold tooth. "That's what I figured." He climbed down and began unfastening the ropes. Keziah helped unload, palms rough against the grain. Branick kept steady watch, saying little. The wagon driver eyed her more than once, but not with the leer she'd learned to expect in Red Fern, more like curiosity. "You two fixing something?" he asked. Branick didn't answer. Keziah met the man's gaze. "There's an old chapel near the river. We're rebuilding it." The man blinked, surprised. "You a preacher?" "No," she said. "Just someone with a mind to teach." He didn't ask more. Once the last beam hit the ground, he tipped his hat and rode off without ceremony, the wagon creaking back into the trees. As soon as the trail quieted, Branick turned to her. "You sure you want to use these hands for teaching?" "I don't mind the splinters," she said. They carried the lumber to the edge of the clearing and stacked it beneath a canvas tarp. Branick measured and marked each board, his movements precise. Keziah stood with her arms folded, watching his hands. She hadn't asked what he'd done before his land went to auction, and he hadn't offered. "You ever build a chapel?" she asked. "No." He didn't look up. "But I helped raise a granary once, down near Virginia City. Wasn't much different. A place to hold something that mattered." She stepped closer. "Why'd you come west?" He set the last board down and straightened, rubbing his neck. "My wife wanted open sky. Said she could breathe better in places where the land didn't press in." Keziah's breath caught. He hadn't spoken her name, not once. Not since she'd arrived. "You miss her?" she asked carefully. Branick's eyes were steady. "I did. For a long while, it was all I did." "And now?" He didn't answer right away. "Now I've got something else to build." They cleared the trail to the river bend the next morning, pulling saplings and cutting back underbrush. The chapel stood crooked, its roof sagging, but the bones remained strong. Keziah climbed onto the beams to test their give while Branick held the ladder steady. She moved with sure steps, skirts tucked and sleeves rolled. "You don't flinch at heights," he said. "I used to climb the hayloft rafters to read where my uncle couldn't find me." He chuckled, low and rough. "You always been this stubborn?" "Only since I learned how often people mistake silence for consent." Branick's mouth twitched. "That's a fine lesson." She looked down at him. "You ever think about what comes after all this?" "You mean after the chapel?" "I mean after the dust settles. After folks stop watching to see if I run again." He adjusted the ladder. "I do think about it. And I think about a table long enough for more than 2 plates. About a porch wide enough for sitting come sundown. About you, reading out loud by lamplight." Her voice softened. That's a fine picture. It's not just a picture, he said. It's what I want. She climbed down carefully, boots steady on each rung. When she reached the ground, she turned to face him, their breaths shared in the close space between. I want that too. He reached for her hand, fingers lacing through hers. Then we'll build it. Not in haste. Not in fear. But with timber chosen piece by piece, and hands that no longer trembled. By late June, the hills had turned the color of old brass, and the days stretched long with heat that pressed like a hand across the shoulders. Branick and Keziah worked in the riverbend clearing nearly every daylight hour. The chapel had taken shape true and strong, its frame upright, the new boards planed smooth. Branick had carved a ridgepole cross, plain and unadorned, and they raised it together just before midsummer. When they rested at midday, they shared bread and pickled carrots beneath the shade of the chapel's eaves. Keziah peeled off her gloves and flexed her fingers, ink stains still faint beneath her nails from the lesson plans she'd begun drafting in the evenings. I stopped dreaming for a while, she said, eyes on the trees. After the last frost took my parents, I'd wake up heavy, like the dark had sunk into my bones. Branick passed her the canteen. That weight don't lift all at once. No, she said, drinking. But it comes off easier when someone doesn't ask you to carry it alone. He leaned back against a beam, legs stretched out. I used to think grief was something to endure in silence. Like if you didn't speak it, it couldn't cut you deeper. And now? I think silence can be sharp, too. She turned to him, watching the way the sunlight dappled his forearms. That first night, when you stood between me and Amos, I didn't think anyone would ever do that. I didn't think either, he said. I just moved. She reached for his hand and laced their fingers. Then maybe that's love. Not what you plan, but what you do without thinking. He didn't answer, only drew her hand to his chest and held it there, steady. The chapel opened its doors on the first Sunday of August. Not for preaching but for learning. Keziah had written to a ranching family near the Bitterroot line, offering to teach their children if they brought them to the riverbend twice a week. Word traveled slow but sure, and by the third week, there were 7 pupils, ranging from 6 to 14, all sun-browned and hesitant. Keziah met them at the doorway, her slate in hand and a firm kindness in her voice. Branick watched from the fence line, arms folded, every line of his face soft with something he didn't name. That night, as she returned with chalk dust on her skirt and a handful of wildflowers from one of the students, Branick had supper waiting: fried salt pork and mashed turnip, set on 2 tin plates beside the fire pit. You built this with me, she said, settling beside him. I built it for you, he replied. No, she said. You built it because you knew I'd use it. And because you believed I could. He looked at her then, not just with affection, but with awe. I never thought I'd get to see you like this, he said. Like what? Alive in the way a person is when they're finally free. She touched his face, her palm resting on the curve of his jaw. Then don't look away. He didn't. They married in the clearing behind the chapel, beneath a cottonwood heavy with new seed. No preacher officiated. Just Branick's old friend from Bozeman, who arrived with a crate of school supplies and a kind of reverence in his voice when he asked if they wished to make promises. Keziah wore a blue dress with a hem she'd restitched 3 times. Branick wore his cleanest shirt and the belt buckle his father had given him when he turned 20. They exchanged words low and simple, hands clasped between them, and when Branick kissed her, it was without hesitation. The kind of kiss that spoke of long roads behind and long roads ahead, but both walked together. They returned home that evening with the sun warm on their backs. Keziah slipped off her shoes by the door and leaned into him, her cheek resting against his chest. What now? She asked, voice muffled against his shirt. Now we live, he said. She tilted her head up. And after? He smiled then, small and sure. We keep living. One day, we'll plant an apple tree by the porch. And maybe a swing for the children when they come. She nodded, her eyes shining. That sounds right. And they did live quietly, deeply, with purpose. The school grew, and so did their home. By the following spring, Branick had added a second room with a cedar floor and a window that faced the dawn. Keziah filled it with books and writing slates, and in time, with the laughter of their firstborn daughter. Years passed, and the trail to the chapel grew worn with footsteps. Families from as far as the Gallatin Basin sent their children to learn under Keziah's steady hand. Branick kept the grounds and carved benches, always with a child at his heels. They grew older with grace, weathered by time but not broken by it. And every night, when the lamps were blown out and the wind curled around the eaves, they reached for each other not out of habit, but out of choice. And always, they chose each other.